The floorboards in the hallway always felt colder than the rest of the house. I spent a lot of my time on those floorboards, scrubbing away the dirt that my stepbrother Alan brought in on his heavy boots. I was 20 years old, an Omega, and in the eyes of my family, I was nothing more than the help. My father had remarried years ago, after my mother passed away. He thought he was giving me a new family, but instead, he gave me a prison. When he died a few years later, the last bit of light in this house went out with him. My stepmother, a woman with a heart made of ice, never called me by my name. To her, I was just girl, or Omega. She made sure I knew my place every single second of the day. While she and Alan sat in the dining room eating warm meals, I was usually in the kitchen, eating whatever scraps were left over. It was a life of quiet dignity and constant resilience. I didn't have a choice. If I fought back, I would be out on the street, and in this kingdom, an Omega alone on the street was as good as dead. Alan was the worst part of my day. He was an alpha, or at least he acted like one when he was bullying me. He was tall, loud, and loved to use his strength to make me feel small. One afternoon, I was trying to study for my final exams. I wanted to be a teacher. I wanted to get out of this house and finally breathe. I had my books spread out on the small wooden table in the corner of the kitchen. The light was fading, and I was squinting at the words, trying to memorize the history of our kingdom. The back door slammed open, and I jumped. Alan walked in, smelling like sweat and arrogance. He saw my books and a mean smile spread across his face. "What do you think you're doing, Celina?" he asked. He didn't wait for an answer. He walked over and picked up my textbook, flipping through the pages with his dirty fingers. "You think an Omega like you is going to pass these tests? You think you're going to sit in a classroom with alphas and betas? You're delusional." "I just want to learn, Alan," I said softly. I kept my head down. I didn't want to give him a reason to get angry. "Please give the book back. I bought that with the money I saved from my cleaning job." "Oh, did you?" He laughed, and it was a cold, sharp sound. "Well, I think you have better things to do." He didn't just drop the book. He walked over to the stove, where a pot of old grease was sitting. He dumped my book right into the grease. My heart shattered as I watched the pages soak up the oil, ruining the words I had worked so hard to understand. "There," he said, patting me on the shoulder with a force that made me wince. "Now go clean the upstairs bathroom. It's filthy, just like you." I didn't cry. I had learned a long time ago that tears didn't do anything in this house. They just made my stepmother laugh. I waited until he left the room, and then I pulled the ruined book out of the grease. I tried to wipe it off with a rag, but the damage was done. This was my life. Every time I tried to take a step forward, someone was there to trip me. School wasn't any better. You would think that a place of learning would be a safe haven, but the social hierarchy followed me there like a shadow. I was one of the few Omegas in my year. Most of the other students were alphas or betas from wealthy families. They looked at me like I was a bug they wanted to squash. I remember walking down the main hallway between classes. I was holding my bag tight against my chest. A group of girls, led by a high-ranking beta named Sarah, blocked my path. "Look at her," Sarah said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "She's wearing the same shoes she wore yesterday. Do you even own a washing machine, Celina? Or do you just smell like a wet dog all the time?" The students around us started to laugh. I tried to walk past them, but one of the boys stuck his foot out. I tripped, and my bag flew open. My few belongings spilled across the floor. A half-eaten apple, a notebook with tea stains, and my cracked pens. "A lowly Omega shouldn't even be allowed to sit in the same room as us," another boy sneered. He stepped on my notebook, leaving a muddy footprint right on the cover. "Go back to the kitchen where you belong." I gathered my things as quickly as I could. My face was hot with shame, but I didn't look up. I just kept my eyes on the floor. I told myself that one day I would be someone. One day I would be far away from here. But as I sat in the back of the lecture hall, ignored by the professor and mocked by my peers, that dream felt like it was miles away. The financial pressure was the heaviest weight of all. My mother had left me an inheritance, a small sum of money that was supposed to pay for my university and help me start a life. But after my father died, my stepmother had taken control of everything. She claimed the money was household expenses, She used it to buy Alan new clothes and herself expensive jewelry. When I asked for my tuition money, she just laughed. "You're lucky we even let you sleep under this roof," she told me once, her eyes narrowing. "If you ask about that money again, you can find a spot on the sidewalk to sleep. Do you understand?" I understood. I worked 3 part-time jobs just to pay for my classes. I cleaned offices at night, delivered papers in the morning, and worked in the school library during my lunch breaks. I was exhausted. My bones ached and my mind was foggy from lack of sleep. But then, the dizzy spells started. It wasn't just exhaustion. I felt a strange, fluttering sensation in my stomach, and sometimes the room would spin until I had to sit down on the floor. I thought maybe I was sick from skipping meals to save money. I finally decided to go to the local clinic. I just wanted some vitamins or maybe some medicine to help me keep going. I went to the hospital on a Tuesday morning. It was a cold, gray day, and the waiting room was crowded. I sat there for 3 hours, feeling smaller and smaller as the minutes ticked by. When the nurse finally called my name, she looked confused. She checked my ID twice and looked at her clipboard. "Celina?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Follow me." She led me to a small room. I thought it was for a blood test. I didn't think much of it when they asked me to lay down and gave me a mild sedative because I was so tense. I drifted off for a few minutes, feeling a strange warmth. When I woke up, the nurse told me I was done and that they would call me with my results. I walked home that day feeling a bit better, thinking the doctors would help me. I didn't know that my life had just ended and begun at the same time. I didn't know that at that very hospital, a woman named Celina had been in the room next to mine. Celina was a woman with a dark plan. She had paid a corrupt doctor to steal the stored sperm of Alpha King Bart Spencer. She wanted to force her way into the royal family by becoming pregnant with his heir. But the files were switched. The names were too similar. The doctor, in his nervous rush to complete a criminal act, didn't double-check the ID. A week later, I was back in the clinic. The doctor didn't look me in the eye. He looked at his shaking hands. "Celina," he said, his voice cracking. "I don't know how to tell you this, but you are pregnant." I felt like the floor had opened up beneath me. "That's impossible," I whispered. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I've never been with a man. I'm an Omega. I'm alone. There is no way." "There was a mix-up," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "A grave, terrible error. You were given a procedure that was meant for someone else, and the material used, it belongs to the Alpha King." I couldn't breathe. The Alpha King, the man who ruled this entire land with a cold, ruthless power. A man I had only seen on the news. I was a servant, a girl who scrubbed floors and was bullied at school, and now I was carrying the child of a king. I walked out of that hospital in a daze. The world looked different. The trees looked sharper. The air felt heavier. I was a girl who had nothing, and now I held the most dangerous secret in the kingdom. I was pregnant. I was alone, and I was terrified. When I got home, Alan was waiting for me in the kitchen. He saw my pale face and smirked. "What's the matter, Omega? Did the doctor tell you that you're even more broken than we thought?" I didn't answer him. I just walked past him and went to my small room under the stairs. I closed the door and sat on my thin mattress. I touched my stomach. It felt the same, but I knew everything had changed. The battle for my life was no longer just about me. It was about the life inside me. And I knew, with a sudden and terrifying certainty, that the Alpha King would be coming for us. The news of my pregnancy didn't just sit in my mind. It felt like a physical weight, a heavy stone that had been dropped into the center of my soul. For 3 days, I moved through the house like a ghost. I scrubbed the same patch of floor until my knuckles bled, and I stared at the walls of my tiny room under the stairs, trying to make sense of a reality that defied every law of logic I knew. I was a virgin, yet I was pregnant. I was an outcast, yet I was carrying the blood of the man who sat on the highest throne in the land. The injustice of it was so thick I could almost taste it, a bitter, metallic tang in the back of my throat. I had spent my whole life trying to be invisible just to survive, and now I was the center of a storm that could drown the entire kingdom. I didn't tell my stepmother. I didn't tell Alan. I knew that if they found out, they wouldn't offer me a hand. They would use the information to crush me even further. They would call me a liar, a whore, or worse. So I kept my mouth shut and worked until my legs shook. But the secret was out in the world, and the world was already reacting. At the palace, the discovery of the theft had sent the Alpha King into a rage that people were talking about in whispers on the street corners. They said the king's private vault at the hospital had been breached, and he was hunting for the person responsible. Every time I heard his name, Alpha King Bart Spencer, my heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest. On the fourth morning, the silence of our neighborhood was shattered. I was in the front yard, pulling weeds from the overgrown garden beds while my stepmother watched from the porch, sipping tea and criticizing my technique. Suddenly, the air itself seemed to vibrate. A line of black, high-end SUVs turned onto our narrow street, their engines humming with a power that made the windows of the nearby houses rattle. Neighbors poked their heads out of their doors, whispering and pointing. These weren't just cars, they were symbols of the throne. The vehicle stopped directly in front of our gate. My stepmother stood up, her face pale, her tea splashing onto her expensive silk robe. "What is this?" she hissed, looking at me as if it were somehow my fault. "Celina, what have you done now?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just stood there, my hands covered in dirt, watching as the doors of the middle vehicle opened. 4 men in suits stepped out, but they weren't the ones who commanded the space. It was the man who followed them. Bart Spencer was taller than I had imagined from the news broadcasts. He wore a dark, tailored suit that looked like armor, and his presence was so heavy it felt like the gravity in the yard had doubled. His eyes were a piercing, icy blue that seemed to look right through the walls of the house, and his jaw was set in a hard, unforgiving line. He was the most beautiful and terrifying thing I had ever seen. Alan came running out of the house, his chest puffed out in that fake alpha way he had. "Hey! You can't just park here. This is private property," he shouted, pointing a finger at the king. Bart Spencer didn't even blink. He didn't even look at Alan. He kept his eyes fixed on me. One of the king's guards stepped forward and caught Alan's wrist, twisting it just enough to make my stepbrother yelp and fall to his knees. "Silence," the guard said, his voice as cold as a winter morning. The king walked toward me. Every step he took felt like a heartbeat. I wanted to run, to hide in the dark corners of the basement, but my feet were rooted to the soil. He stopped just 2 feet away from me. The scent of him, expensive wood, rain, and a hint of something wild, filled my lungs. "You are Celina," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was a deep, resonant rumble that made the small hairs on my arms stand up. "Yes," I whispered. I tried to look him in the eye, but the intensity of his gaze was too much. I looked at his polished shoes instead. "The hospital records were switched," he continued, his voice dropping an octave. "You were the recipient of a procedure meant for a criminal. You are carrying my child." Behind him, I heard my stepmother gasp. "A child? Celina? That's impossible. She's a servant. She hasn't even had a boyfriend." Bart Spencer turned his head slightly, and the look he gave her was so sharp it could have drawn blood. She went silent instantly, her mouth hanging open. Then he looked back at me. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not anger, but a strange kind of curiosity. He looked at my dirt-stained clothes, my thin frame, and the way I was shaking despite my best efforts to stay still. "Come with me," he commanded. I can't," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. I was terrified. "I have school. I have work. I have to finish the garden." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, but it wasn't a kind one. It was the smile of a predator who found his prey interesting. "You no longer have a garden to tend, Celina. You belong to the crown now. Everything you were yesterday is gone." He reached out and took my hand. His skin was warm, and his grip was firm but not painful. It was the first time in years that someone had touched me without the intent to hurt me. As he led me toward the car, Alan tried to stand up. "You can't take her. She owes us. She hasn't finished her chores," Alan yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. The king stopped and looked back. The air around him seemed to darken. "If I hear another word from you or your mother," Bart said, his voice echoing off the surrounding houses, "I will have this entire property razed to the ground. You have spent years mistreating a woman who carries my blood. Be grateful I am leaving you with your lives." The car door was opened for me, and I climbed into the soft leather interior. It felt like stepping into another world. The seats were heated, and the air was perfectly climate-controlled. As we pulled away, I watched my house grow, smaller in the window. I saw Alan and my stepmother standing in the dirt, looking smaller and more pathetic than they ever had. I should have felt happy, but all I felt was a crushing sense of dread. I was being rescued, but I was also being captured. We drove in silence for a long time. The king sat across from me, his long legs crossed, watching me with that same intense focus. He didn't say a word, and neither did I. I just looked at my dirty fingernails against the expensive upholstery and felt like an intruder. Eventually, we arrived at the palace, a sprawling estate of white stone and glass that sat on top of a hill overlooking the city. It was beautiful, but it felt like a fortress. We were led into a grand office filled with books that reached the ceiling. A man in a lab coat and a woman in a sharp business suit were waiting for us. The king sat behind a massive desk and motioned for me to sit in a chair opposite him. "This is Dr. Heir and my legal counsel, Ms. Vance," Bart said. "They have confirmed the details. The mix-up was a result of a switch between your file and a woman named Celina. She is currently being hunted by my security forces." "I didn't do anything," I said, my voice finally finding its strength. "I went in for a checkup. I didn't ask for this. I didn't want this." "I know," Bart said. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "And for that, I am prepared to offer you a settlement. $5 million, a house in the coastal district, and a full scholarship to any university in the world. In exchange, the child remains with me once it is born, and you sign a non-disclosure agreement." The room went very still. $5 million. It was more money than I could even imagine. I could be free. I could leave the stepfamily, leave the school where people mocked me, and start a new life where no one knew my name. It was the perfect escape. But as I sat there, I thought about the life growing inside me. It wasn't just a material or a medical error. It was a person. And that person was half me. I had been treated like an object my entire life. I had been used, ignored, and discarded. If I took the money, I was doing the same thing to my own child. I was selling them. I looked the king in the eye. For the first time, I didn't look away. "No," I said. Ms. Vance blinked. "I'm sorry? You want more money? We can negotiate the—" "I don't want your money," I interrupted. I felt a surge of heat in my chest. "You think you can just buy a person? You think because I'm an Omega and I have nothing, I don't have a heart? This baby isn't a bargaining chip. I won't sell my child." The king's eyes widened slightly. I could tell he wasn't used to being told no. "Then what is it you want, Celina? You cannot raise a royal heir in a shack while working 3 jobs. You know that." "I want a father for this baby," I said, my voice trembling but certain. "I want you to promise me that you won't just hide them away in a nursery. I want them to be loved. I want them to be a real part of a family. If you want this child to be your heir, then you have to be a father, a real one." Bart Spencer stared at me for a long time. The silence was so heavy, I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over his kingdom. "You are a strange woman," he said softly, almost to himself. He turned back to me. "Very well. If it is a family you want, then that is what we will do. We will enter into a contract marriage. You will live here, you will be my queen in the eyes of the public, and we will raise this child together. But you must understand, Celina, this is a business arrangement. There will be no love between us. You will play your part, and I will play mine." "I understand," I said. I didn't need his love. I had learned to live without love a long time ago. What I needed was safety. What I needed was a future for my baby. "Then it is settled," he said. He looked at Ms. Vance. "Prepare the papers. We marry at the end of the month." I stood up, my legs feeling like jelly. As I walked out of the room, I caught a glimpse of myself in a mirror in the hallway. I was covered in dirt, my hair was a mess, and my eyes looked tired. But for the first time in my life, I didn't look like a victim. I looked like a woman who had just changed the world. That night, as I lay in a bed that was softer than anything I had ever touched, I realized that I had traded one prison for another. But this time, the bars were made of gold, and the man holding the key was the most powerful alpha in the world. I closed my eyes and whispered a promise to my stomach. I would protect this child, even if it cost me everything. The journey was just beginning, and I knew that the road ahead would be paved with more than just gold. It would be paved with blood, secrets, and a love that hadn't even begun to wake up. The transition from a dusty kitchen floor to the marble halls of the royal palace was a shock that my body didn't know how to handle. Every time I moved, I felt like I was breaking a rule. The air in the palace was different. It was filtered, cool, and smelled faintly of expensive lilies and old wood. It was a world where silence was a sign of power, not a sign of fear. I was given a suite of rooms that was larger than my stepmother's entire house. The bed was draped in silk, and the windows looked out over a garden so perfectly manicured it looked like a painting. But as I sat on the edge of that bed, my hands still felt rough from years of scrubbing, and my heart still beat with the frantic rhythm of a girl waiting for a blow to fall. I spent my first few days in the palace trying to stay out of the way. I didn't want to cause trouble. I didn't want the king to regret his decision and send me back to the dirt. I mostly stayed in my room, speaking only to Ray, the personal aide Bart had assigned to me. Ray was an older beta with a kind face and eyes that seemed to see everything without judging any of it. He was the first person in the palace who didn't look at me like I was a medical accident. He brought me my meals and showed me how to use the complicated shower system, and he never once made me feel like a lowly omega. "You should eat more, Miss Celina," Ray said one morning as he set a tray of fresh fruit, eggs, and pastries on the small table near the window. "The little one needs you to be strong." "I'm trying, Ray," I said, picking up a piece of melon. It was so sweet it almost made me want to cry. It's all so much. I keep waiting for someone to tell me this is a joke and throw me back outside." Ray smiled, a gentle expression that reached his eyes. "The king does not tell jokes, miss. He is a man of his word. If he says you belong here, then you belong here. You should try to rest. Your life is about to become very busy." He was right. The following morning, the peace was shattered. I was in my room, trying to read a book Ray had found for me when the door opened. It wasn't Ray. It was Bart. He looked as imposing as ever, dressed in a charcoal suit that emphasized the broadness of his shoulders. He didn't wait for me to stand up. He just walked in and stood in the center of the room, his presence filling every corner. "We have a problem," he said. His voice was like low thunder. I felt that old familiar coldness crawl up my spine. "What did I do?" I asked, my voice small. Bart frowned, a deep crease appearing between his eyebrows. "You didn't do anything, Celina. But your presence here is no longer a secret. The news of the hospital mix-up has leaked to the higher circles of the nobility, and your family is not helping." "Alan," I whispered. I knew it. He couldn't keep his mouth shut. "Your stepbrother has been seen at several high-end bars, bragging about his connection to the throne," Bart said, his jaw tightening. "He's been trying to sell exclusive stories about you to the tabloids. He's telling anyone who will listen that you are a cursed Omega who used dark magic to steal my child." I felt a surge of hot shame. "I'm so sorry. I knew they were mean, but I didn't think he would go this far. I'll go talk to him. I'll tell him to stop." Bart walked over to me, stopping just a few inches from my chair. He looked down at me, and for a moment, the icy blue of his eyes softened just a fraction. "You will do no such thing. You are under my protection now. I deal with threats to my family, and that includes you. I am going to your old home to settle this once and for all. You are coming with me." "But I don't want to see them," I said, my hands beginning to shake. "You need to see them," Bart said firmly. "You need to see that they have no power over you anymore. If you are going to be my queen, you cannot be afraid of shadows from your past." The drive back to my old neighborhood felt like a descent into a nightmare. The familiar sights, the cracked sidewalks, the overgrown lawns, the gray houses, made my stomach knot with anxiety. When the car stopped in front of the gate, I saw Alan and my stepmother standing on the porch. They looked like they were waiting for a payout. Alan had a smug look on his face, and my stepmother was wearing a new dress that I knew she couldn't afford. As soon as I stepped out of the car, Alan started shouting, "There she is, the little thief! Hey, King, how much are you paying for her?" "We want our cut. We raised her, we fed her, We deserve a reward for putting up with her for all these years." I felt my face go pale. I wanted to crawl back into the car and disappear. But then, I felt a heavy weight on my shoulder. Bart had placed his hand there, his fingers firm and steady. He led me through the gate and up the walk, his gaze fixed on Alan, like a predator tracking a particularly annoying insect. "You want a reward?" Bart asked. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made the air feel thick. "Yeah," Alan said, though his voice wavered as the king got closer. "We've got stories. We know all about her curse. We can make things very difficult for you if you don't play ball." Bart stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He didn't look angry. He looked bored, which was somehow more terrifying. "I have already looked into the inheritance you stole from this woman," Bart said. "I have the records of every cent you took from her mother's estate. I have the medical records of the bruises you gave her, and I have the testimony of the neighbors who watched you treat her like a dog." My stepmother's face went from pale to ghostly white. That was just family discipline," she stammered. "You don't understand how difficult she was." "What I understand," Bart said, stepping up onto the porch until he was looming over Alan, "is that you are a small, pathetic man who thinks he can threaten a king. You have spent years hurting someone who had no one to defend her. That ends today." Bart didn't raise his hand, but his alpha aura flared, a sudden, violent surge of dominance that made my knees weak. Alan crumpled. He literally fell back onto the porch floor, his eyes wide with a terror I had never seen in him before. "If I see your face again," Bart said, his voice a low, lethal growl, "or if I hear your name in connection to a single rumor about my wife, I will personally see to it that you spend the rest of your life in the darkest cell I can find. I will take everything you own, this house, your clothes, your very name, and I will leave you with nothing but the memory of this moment. Do you understand me?" Alan nodded frantically, unable to speak. My stepmother was huddled against the doorframe, trembling. Bart turned back to me. He didn't say a word, but he held out his hand. I took it, my fingers lacing through his. As we walked back to the car, I felt something shift inside me. The house didn't look scary anymore. It just looked small. It looked like a place I used to live, a place that no longer had any claim on me. We drove back to the palace in silence. I kept looking at the hand he had held, feeling the lingering warmth of his skin. When we arrived, Bart led me inside, but he didn't head for his office. He led me toward a part of the palace I hadn't seen yet, a high balcony that overlooked the entire city. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. "Why did you do that?" I asked, looking out at the lights beginning to twinkle in the valley below. "You didn't have to come with me. You could have just sent your guards." Bart leaned against the stone railing, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I told you, Celina, you are carrying my heir. But more than that, I do not tolerate bullies. I spent a long time becoming powerful so that no one could ever do to me what they did to you." It was the first time he had ever mentioned his own past. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I didn't see a king. I saw a man who had his own scars, even if they were hidden under a $1,000 suit. "Thank you," I said softly. He turned to look at me, and for a long moment we just stood there in the fading light. The contract was clear. This was a business arrangement. There was no room for feelings or heartbeats that skipped. But as the wind blew a strand of hair across my face and he reached out to tuck it behind my ear, his fingers brushing against my skin, the business felt very far away. "You should get some sleep," he said, his voice dropping to that low rumble that always made my heart race. "The wedding is in 2 weeks. The world will be watching, and you need to be ready." "I'll be ready," I promised. As I walked back to my room, I felt a strange sense of peace. I was still an Omega. I was still pregnant with a child that had arrived through a crime. I was still entering a marriage that was built on paper and ink. But for the first time in my life, I felt safe, I felt protected. And as I touched my stomach, I whispered a silent thank you to the man who had stood between me and the monsters of my past. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I wouldn't be facing it alone. The king was my shield, and for now, that was enough. The 2 weeks leading up to the wedding were a blur of silk, needles, and exhausting etiquette. If the previous days were about protection, these days were about transformation. I was no longer the girl who scrubbed the grease off the stove. I was being sculpted into a monument of royal grace. But inside, I felt like a hollow shell. Every time a tailor adjusted the hem of my gown, or a stylist tutted over the calluses on my palms, I felt the walls of the palace closing in. This wasn't a home, it was a high-stakes theater, and I was the lead actress who hadn't been given a script. The tone of the mansion had shifted from protective to professional. Bart was rarely around during the day. He was busy with the kingdom's affairs, leaving me to the mercy of a small army of tutors and designers. I learned how to walk with a book on my head, how to hold a crystal glass without clinking it against my teeth, and how to smile without letting the sadness reach my eyes. It was a cold, clinical kind of life. I missed the smell of the rain on the pavement and even the messy chaos of the school library. Here, everything was sanitized, perfect, and utterly lonely. One afternoon, Ray found me sitting on the floor of my massive walk-in closet, hiding behind a rack of evening gowns. I just needed a moment where no one was looking at me, measuring me, or judging my posture. "Miss Celina?" Ray's voice was soft as he peeked through the fabric. "The jeweler is here with the tiaras. He says the king insisted on the diamonds from the northern mines." "Tell him I'll be there in a minute, Ray," I said, my voice muffled by a velvet dress. I can't breathe in that room anymore. Everyone looks at me like I'm a science project, or a mistake they're trying to fix with expensive rocks. Ray sat down on a small cushioned stool near the closet door. He didn't tell me to get up, he just waited. "It is a heavy crown, even before it is placed on your head, but remember why you are doing this. You aren't doing it for the diamonds. You are doing it for the life that is growing inside you. That little one is going to need a mother who knows how to navigate these halls." I leaned my head against the wall and closed my eyes. "I know. But I feel like I'm losing myself, Ray. I don't recognize the girl in the mirror anymore. She looks like a queen, but she feels like a ghost." "Sometimes we have to become someone else to survive," Ray said quietly. "The king did it. He wasn't born this cold, Miss Celina. Life made him that way. But you? You have a warmth that this palace hasn't seen in a long time. Don't let them polish that away." I took a deep breath, stood up and brushed off my skirt. Ray was right. I couldn't afford to be weak. I walked out into the main room, where a nervous-looking man was holding a velvet tray covered in shimmering jewels. I picked the simplest tiara, a delicate band of silver and small diamonds that looked like frozen starlight. I didn't want the biggest one. I wanted the one that felt the least like a weight. That evening, Bart requested my presence for dinner. It wasn't the usual grand dining hall. It was a smaller, more intimate balcony off his private study. The air was cool, and the scent of the night-blooming jasmine from the gardens below was intoxicating. Bart was already there, his jacket off, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked tired, but when he saw me, he stood up and pulled out my chair. "You look exhausted," he said. It wasn't a compliment or a criticism. It was an observation. "I've spent 8 hours learning how to curtsy to people who I know hate me," I said, sitting down. "It's more tiring than scrubbing floors." Bart sat back down and poured a glass of sparkling water for me. "The nobility is a den of vipers, Celina. They value bloodlines and history above all else. To them, you are an outsider who bypassed the gates. They will try to find the cracks in your armor. I am trying to make sure there are no cracks." "I'm an Omega from a broken home, Bart," I said, looking him in the eye. "There are nothing but cracks. No amount of diamonds is going to change where I came from." "I don't want to change where you came from," Bart said, his voice dropping to that low, resonant rumble. "I want to change where you are going. You have a strength that most of these noble women will never understand. They have never had to fight for anything. You have fought for every breath you've ever taken. That makes you more dangerous than any of them." It was the most he had ever said to me about how he viewed me. I felt a strange warmth spread through my chest, a feeling that had nothing to do with the spicy soup the servants had just placed in front of us. "I heard about the contract," I said, changing the subject before I could get too comfortable with the look in his eyes. "Ms. Vance said the final version is ready for signing. She said it includes a clause about our public appearances. Yes, Bart said, his face returning to its professional mask. We must appear to be a devoted couple. The public needs to believe that this was a whirlwind romance, not a medical error. If they suspect the truth, the legitimacy of the heir will be questioned. We will have to attend galas, give interviews, and demonstrate affection. Demonstrate affection, I repeated. The words felt cold and clinical, like a performance. Exactly, Bart said. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the lights of the city. It is a necessity. I am sorry if it is distasteful to you. It's not distasteful, I said softly. It's just sad to live a whole life as a performance. Don't you ever get tired of it? Bart didn't answer for a long time. He just watched the shadows dance on the stone floor. I stopped thinking about what I wanted a long time ago, Celina. I do what is required for the kingdom. That is the burden of the crown. We ate the rest of the meal in a silence that felt different than before. It wasn't the silence of strangers, but the silence of two people who were trapped in the same beautiful cage. As the dinner ended, Bart walked me back to my room. At the door, he stopped and turned to me. I have something for you, he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather book. Ray told me your textbook was ruined. I couldn't find the exact edition, but this is a first printing history of the Northern Territories. I thought you might like to study something that wasn't a royal decree. I took the book, my fingers brushing against his. The leather was soft and smelled of old paper and cedar. It was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for me. It wasn't a diamond tiara or a silk dress. It was a book. He had remembered. Thank you, Bart, I whispered. He nodded, a sharp, quick motion. Good night, Celina. Try to sleep. Tomorrow we begin the final rehearsals for the ceremony. I watched him walk away down the long, shadowed hallway. I went into my room, sat on the edge of the bed, and opened the book. Inside the front cover, in a bold, disciplined handwriting, was a single note. For the girl who refuses to be bought. I touched the words with my fingertips. This was the man the world feared. The cold-hearted Alpha King. And yet, he had seen the one part of me that I thought was hidden forever. I realized then that the contract wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a bridge. I didn't know where it led, and I didn't know if I was ready to cross it, but as I held the book to my chest, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't fear. It was curiosity. And in this palace of cold stone and sharp whispers, curiosity was the most dangerous thing of all. The wedding was only a few days away. The world was preparing for a fairy tale, but I was preparing for a war. I looked at the tiara sitting on the vanity, reflecting the moonlight. It was beautiful, yes, but as I tucked the history book under my pillow, I knew which one was the real treasure. I was a queen in training, a mother in waiting, and for the first time, I felt like I was more than just a recipient of a mistake. I was a player in the game, and I intended to win. The day of the wedding arrived with a sky so clear it felt mocking. I woke up before the sun, watching the pale blue light creep across the silk wallpaper of my suite. Today, I was to become the Luna of the entire kingdom. Today, I was to bind my life to a man I barely knew, all because of a mistake in a sterile hospital room. My heart felt like a trapped bird, beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I sat in front of the vanity while 4 women hovered over me, their fingers moving with clinical precision. They painted my face, pinned my hair into an intricate crown of braids, and laced me into a dress made of heavy white satin and antique lace. It was beautiful, but it felt like a shroud. You look like a goddess, Miss Celina, one of the stylists whispered, stepping back to admire her work. I looked at the girl in the glass. She was shimmering. She was perfect. But her eyes, my eyes, were wide with a quiet, simmering dread. I wasn't a goddess. I was an Omega who had spent most of her life hoping someone wouldn't notice she was breathing. Now the eyes of millions were about to turn toward me. I reached out and touched the cool glass, feeling the distance between the girl I used to be and the queen I was becoming. The cathedral was a sea of gold and white. The scent of 1,000 lilies was so thick it made my head swim as the heavy oak doors swung open. I took a deep breath, clutching my bouquet of white roses until the thorns pricked my fingers through my gloves. I walked down the long, red-carpeted aisle alone. My father wasn't there to give me away, and my stepfamily was nowhere to be found. I walked toward the altar, where Bart stood waiting. He was dressed in his full military regalia, a sash of deep crimson across his chest and medals that caught the light. He looked like a statue carved from granite, powerful, unmoving, and utterly untouchable. As I reached him, he stepped down and took my hand. His grip was the only thing keeping me upright. We turned to face the priest, and for a moment the world was silent. I could hear the rustle of the guests' silk clothes and the distant chime of the bells. We began the vows, the ancient, heavy words that promised protection, loyalty, and a shared life. I spoke my part in a voice that sounded like a stranger's, steady and clear. I, Celina, take you, Bart, to be my alpha and my king. I object. The voice sliced through the sacred silence like a jagged blade. The heavy doors at the back of the cathedral burst open, slamming against the stone walls. A woman stormed down the aisle, her hair wild and her eyes burning with a manic intensity. It was Celina, the woman whose name was mistaken for mine at the hospital. She wasn't wearing wedding clothes, she was wearing the bitterness of a woman whose grand plan had failed. Behind her, the guards scrambled to catch up, but she was already halfway to the altar. "This is a lie!" Celina screamed, her finger pointing directly at me. The guests gasped, a wave of whispers rising like a tide. "This girl is a fraud. She is nothing but a common flirt. A girl who spent her school days throwing herself at every alpha who walked the halls. She doesn't belong on that throne. She stole my life, and she stole that child." I felt the blood drain from my face. The accusations were baseless, cruel lies, but in a room filled with people who already doubted me, they were poison. I felt the judgment of the nobility pressing down on me. I looked at the front row and saw Linda Smith, the head of the most powerful family in the kingdom. She didn't look shocked, she looked disgusted. "Is this the woman you bring into our bloodline, Bart?" Linda stood up, her voice dripping with social poison. "A girl of such low character? A girl who was the talk of the academy for all the wrong reasons? It is a disgrace to the crown and to all of us." I felt small. I felt like the girl in the school hallway again, watching my books soak in grease. The humiliation was a physical weight, pulling me down to the floor. I let go of Bart's hand, ready to run, ready to disappear into the shadows where I belonged. But Bart didn't let go. He caught my hand again, his fingers tightening with a fierce, protective strength. He stepped in front of me, his massive frame shielding me from the stares of the crowd. When he spoke, his voice didn't just carry through the room, it shook the very foundations of the cathedral. "Enough." The room went deathly silent. Celina froze in her tracks, the guards finally catching her arms. Bart looked at Linda Smith first, his eyes glowing with a dangerous golden light. "Linda, you speak of character and bloodlines while you stand in the house of the gods and insult my wife," Bart said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "Celina has more dignity in her smallest finger than your entire family has in its history. She has survived more than any of you could imagine, and she has done it with a grace you will never possess." He turned his gaze to Celina, who was trembling now, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. "And you are the thief. You tried to steal a legacy that was never yours, and because of your greed, an innocent woman was violated. You will be taken to the dungeons, and you will stay there until I decide if you deserve to see the sun again." "Take her away," Bart commanded. The guards dragged a screaming Celina out of the cathedral. The doors shut with a heavy thud, leaving the room in a stunned, vibrating silence. Bart turned back to me. He didn't look at the guests, he didn't look at the priest. He looked only at me. He reached out and cupped my face with his hand, his thumb brushing away a single tear I hadn't realized I'd shed. "You are my Luna," he whispered, loud enough only for me to hear. "And no one in this room or this kingdom will ever disrespect you again. Do you understand?" "I understand," I breathed. The ceremony continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The performance was over, and something real had taken its place. We finished the vows, and when Bart kissed me to seal the union, it wasn't a clinical demonstration of affection. It was a promise. It was the heat of a fire in a cold room. As we walked out of the cathedral as husband and wife, the bells began to ring again, but this time they sounded like a victory. I looked at the crowd, and I saw the faces of the people who had mocked me. They were bowing now. They were lowering their eyes. Not because they loved me, but because they feared the man who stood by my side. But as the carriage pulled away, taking us toward our new life, I realized that the battle wasn't over. I had seen the look in Linda Smith's eyes. It wasn't just disgust, it was a deep, ancient hatred. And as I looked at my new husband, I realized that the story of why my mother died, why my inheritance was stolen, and why I was truly born an Omega was hidden somewhere in the shadows of this kingdom. I was a queen now. I had a king. I had a child on the way. But the thorns were still sharp, and the garden of the palace was filled with secrets that were just beginning to bloom. I touched my stomach and looked out at the passing city. I was ready to fight, because for the first time in my life, I had something worth fighting for. The wedding was over, but the war inside my head was just beginning. Moving into the king's private wing of the mansion felt like stepping into a cold, beautiful museum where I was the most fragile exhibit. The gold leaf on the walls and the silk rugs beneath my feet didn't make the nightmares go away. If anything, the silence of the palace made the echoes of my past louder. Every time a door slammed in the distance, I jumped. Every time a servant moved too quickly behind me, I flinched, expecting a blow that never came. Years of being treated like a broken thing had carved deep grooves into my spirit. My body remembered the lessons Alan and my stepmother had taught me, even if my mind knew I was safe. I spent my nights staring at the ceiling of the massive royal bed, feeling like an intruder in my own life. The bed was too soft, too big, and far too exposed. One night, the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to shift into the shape of Alan's raised fist. I couldn't breathe. The air felt like water, heavy and suffocating. I scrambled out of the bed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a frantic drum. I didn't think. I just reacted. I grabbed a spare pillow and a thin blanket and curled up on the hard marble floor in the narrow space between the bed and the wall. It was cramped, cold, and hidden. It felt like home. On the floor I was small. On the floor no one would notice me. I finally fell into a fitful, shallow sleep. I woke up to the sound of a heavy footfall. I bolted upright, my breath hitching, only to see Bart standing over me. He was dressed in a silk robe, his hair messy and his eyes dark with a mixture of confusion and something that looked like physical pain. He had come in to check on me, or perhaps he had heard me whimpering in my sleep. "Celina," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration in the quiet room. "Why are you on the floor?" I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders, feeling a hot flush of shame creep up my neck. I just couldn't sleep in the bed. It's too much." Bart didn't look angry. He looked devastated. He reached down and for a second I ducked my head, an old habit I couldn't break. He froze, his hand hovering in midair. He saw it, the way I feared him, the way I feared everyone. A muscle jumped in his jaw. "I am not going to hurt you, Celina," he said, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. "Never. Not in this life or the next." He knelt down on the marble, ignoring the cold of the stone. He didn't pull me up. He just stayed there at my level. "The floor is for those who have been defeated. You are the Luna of this kingdom. You are carrying my heir, and you are the bravest person I have ever met." "I don't feel brave," I whispered, a tear escaping and trailing down my cheek. "I feel like a mistake that won't go away." "You are the only thing in this palace that isn't a mistake," Bart said. He reached out again, slower this time, and tucked a stray hair behind my ear. His touch was like a spark of electricity against my skin. "Your health matters. The baby's health matters. You will sleep in the bed, not because I command it, but because you deserve to be held by something soft for once in your life." He stood up and offered me his hand. I took it, and he lifted me with an ease that made me feel weightless. He placed me back on the bed and pulled the covers up to my chin. He didn't leave. He pulled a chair over to the side of the bed and sat there, his presence a silent, immovable wall between me and the darkness. "Stay?" I asked, the word barely a breath. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. In the days that followed, the tension between us began to change. It wasn't just about the contract anymore. Bart started coming home earlier. He would find me in the library or the garden, and instead of talking about politics or the press, he would ask me things. He wanted to know what my favorite color was, what I dreamed about when I wasn't having nightmares, and why I liked the history of the Northern Territories so much. They were the rebels. I explained one afternoon as we sat in the sun-drenched conservatory. I was showing him a map in the book he had given me. The people of the north didn't care about titles or gold. They cared about the land and their packs. They were free. Bart watched me as I spoke, his gaze intense and unblinking. You have a lot of the north in you, Celina. You have a quiet strength. It reminds me of... He trailed off, his eyes clouding over with a memory he wasn't ready to share. Reminds you of what? I asked. Of something ancient, he said, standing up abruptly. Something the world has forgotten. I didn't understand what he meant, but I felt a strange pull toward him that I couldn't explain. He was so different from the cold king the public saw. With me, he was careful. He was deliberate. He treated me like I was made of glass, but he also treated me like I was a person who had thoughts worth hearing. However, the peace of the mansion was a fragile thing. One morning, I received a letter. It had no return address, and the paper was heavy and expensive. Inside was a single sentence written in a sharp, elegant hand. The golden-eyed wolf thinks she is safe, but winter is coming for what it lost. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I looked in the mirror, staring at my own eyes. They were a rare, striking gold, a trait I had inherited from my mother, Emma. She had always told me to keep my head down, to never let people see the light in my eyes if I could help it. She had died when I was young, taken by a fever that the doctors couldn't explain. But looking at that letter, and thinking about the hatred in Linda Smith's eyes at the wedding, I realized my mother hadn't died of a sickness. She had died of a secret. I went to find Calvin, the head of the palace guard. He was a sturdy beta with a kind heart who often shared his lunch with the younger guards. I found him in the training courtyard, wiping sweat from his brow. "Calvin," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I need you to do something for me. I need you to teach me how to fight." Calvin looked surprised. "Miss Celina, the king wouldn't like that. He wants you protected." "I can't just be protected," I said, stepping closer. I thought of the baby, the letter, and the way Celina had looked at me. I need to be able to protect my child. I need to be a mother who can stand between her baby and the world. Please. Calvin looked at my determined face and sighed. "Fine. But we do it early, before the king wakes up, and you have to promise to be careful." "I promise," I said, a small smile breaking through my worry. "And I'll bake you those cookies you like, the ones with the extra chocolate." It was a small deal, a simple moment of human connection. But as I walked back to my room, I felt a flicker of the north in my blood. I was done being a servant. I was done being a victim. I was a queen. I was a mother, and if the winter was coming for me, I was going to be ready to meet it with a fire of my own. I didn't know that Bart was watching me from his office window, his expression unreadable. He saw the way I walked, shoulders back, head held high. He saw the change in me before I even fully realized it myself. The contract was just a piece of paper, but the woman holding it was becoming something that no contract could ever contain. The air at 5 in the morning was crisp and tasted of damp stone. I moved through the silent corridors of the mansion, my footsteps light against the polished marble. I was dressed in a pair of old leggings and a loose tunic I had kept from my life before the palace. In my hands I carried a small tin of homemade cookies, still warm from the oven. It was a humble peace offering for Calvin, the man who was risking the king's temper to give me the one thing I lacked, the ability to strike back. When I reached the training courtyard, Calvin was already there, his breath huffing out in small white clouds. He looked at the tin in my hands and cracked a rare, genuine smile. "You're early, Miss Celina," he said, taking the tin. "And you kept your word. I haven't had a decent cookie since my mother moved to the coast." "It's the least I can do, Calvin," I said, stretching my arms. My muscles felt tight, but my heart was light. "I don't want to be a burden. I want to be a shield." We began with the basics. Calvin taught me how to stand, how to find my center of gravity so that an alpha's strength couldn't easily topple me. He taught me how to ball my fist without breaking my own thumb, and how to use the momentum of a larger opponent against them. It was grueling work. My lungs burned, and my shins were soon covered in angry purple bruises, but I didn't stop. Every time I felt like quitting, I thought of the golden-eyed wolf in the letter. I thought of my mother's fever. Again, Calvin commanded, his voice firm but encouraging. If someone grabs your throat, you don't pull away. You tuck your chin and strike the eyes. Use everything you have, Celina. And Omega's greatest weapon is that everyone expects them to give up. I lunged forward, my palms striking the padded shield Calvin held. I felt the shock travel up my arm, a jolting reminder that I was alive. We laughed together when I finally managed to trip him with a swift sweep of my leg. It was a moment of pure, uncomplicated human connection. Two people in a courtyard, sharing a secret and a goal. But the laughter died in my throat when I looked toward the stone archway. Bart stood there, his silhouette framed by the rising sun. He wasn't wearing his royal medals or his tailored suit. He was in a simple black training shirt that clung to the hard lines of his chest and shoulders. His expression was a mask of cold, vibrating fury. The air around him seemed to hum with the weight of his alpha aura, a pressure so intense that the birds in the garden stopped singing. "Calvin," Bart said. His voice was a low, lethal whisper. "I believe I gave you orders to oversee the perimeter security this morning." Calvin snapped to attention, his face going pale. "Sire, Miss Celina asked for assistance, and I thought—" "You thought wrong," Bart interrupted. He walked toward us, his steps measured and dangerous. He didn't look at Calvin, he looked only at me. He saw the sweat on my brow and the bruises on my legs. He saw the cookies on the bench. "Leave us." Calvin didn't hesitate. He bowed deeply and vanished into the shadows of the hallway. I stood my ground, though my knees felt like they might give way. I wasn't the girl from the kitchen anymore, and I refused to act like one. "Why are you angry?" I asked, my voice echoing in the quiet courtyard. "I wanted to learn. Is it a crime for a queen to know how to defend herself?" Bart stopped a foot away from me. The heat radiating from his body was overwhelming. "It is my job to defend you, Celina. That was the contract. You are carrying my heir, and you are out here risking your safety with a guard who should know better. Your guards weren't there when I was scrubbing floors." I snapped, the years of resentment bubbling to the surface. They weren't there when Alan threw my books in the grease or when Sarah tripped me in the hall. I have spent 20 years being the person everyone forgot to protect. I am done waiting for a hero, Bart. I want to be my own. Bart's eyes flared with a sudden, golden light, the same light I had seen in the mirror. He reached out, his hand hovering near my waist, but he didn't touch me. He looked at the cookies on the bench again, his jaw tightening so hard I thought it might break. "You gave him cookies," he said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. I blinked, confused by the sudden shift in his tone. They were a thank you. He was helping me. "I am your husband," Bart growled, stepping into my personal space. The jealousy was so thick I could practically taste it. It was irrational, dominant, and entirely alpha. "If you want to learn to fight, you will learn from me. If you want to give someone your time, it will be me. Do you understand, Celina? I do not share what is mine." "I am not your property, Bart," I whispered, though my heart was racing for a reason that had nothing to do with fear. "I am your wife." "Then act like it," he said. He grabbed a pair of training gloves from the rack and tossed them at me. "Square your shoulders. If you want to learn to hit, show me what you've got." The training session that followed was nothing like the one with Calvin. It was intimate, high tension, and physically electric. Bart didn't go easy on me. He forced me to move, to react, to think. His hands were everywhere, correcting the angle of my hips, steadying my shoulders, catching my wrists when I swung too wide. Every touch felt like a brand. Every time our bodies collided, a jolt of heat surged through me, blurring the lines between the training and something far deeper. We ended up on the mats, gasping for air. He had me pinned, his weight pressing me into the foam, his face inches from mine. The silence of the courtyard was filled only with the sound of our synchronized breathing. "You're fast," he admitted, his voice rough. He looked at my lips, and for a second, the king disappeared. There was only the man, the alpha who had spent his life being a wall and had finally found someone worth standing in front of. "I had a good teacher," I whispered. He started to pull away, but I reached up and caught his hand. The contact was brief, but it was enough. "Bart, the letter. I think someone knows who I am. Someone who knew my mother." Bart's expression went stone cold again, but this time it wasn't directed at me. He helped me up, his grip firm and protective. I know about the letter, Celina. My security team intercepted the courier, but the trail went cold at the Smith estate. Linda Smith, I said, the name feeling like ash in my mouth. Why does she hate me so much? Because you're a threat to everything she believes in, Bart said. He led me toward the palace, his arm draped possessively over my shoulders. But you aren't alone anymore. We are going to those prenatal classes today. We are going to be seen. We are going to show this kingdom that you are untouchable. As we walked inside, I realized that the contract was a ghost. We were two people tied together by blood, secrets, and a growing fire that neither of us knew how to put out. I had set out to learn how to fight, but as I looked at the man walking beside me, I realized the real battle wouldn't be fought with fists. It would be fought with the heart. Bart? I asked as we reached my door. Yes? I'll bake you some cookies too, I said with a small, shy smile. If you promise not to scare off the next guard who tries to be nice to me. He huffed a short, dry laugh, the first real laugh I had ever heard from him. No promises, Celina. No promises at all. The evening of the Royal Winter Ball was a masterpiece of cold elegance. The grand ballroom was a cavern of white marble and crystal, lit by thousands of candles that made the air shimmer like a hazy dream. I stood at the top of the grand staircase, my hand resting on Bart's arm. I was wearing a gown of midnight blue that seemed to hold the stars themselves, and the silver tiara sat light on my head. But as I looked down at the sea of faces, the nobility, the power brokers, the enemies in silk, I felt like I was walking into a trap. Breathe, Celina, Bart whispered, his voice a low vibration against my ear. He squeezed my hand, his thumb tracing a steady circle against my skin. You are the most powerful woman in this room. Remember that. I don't feel powerful, I admitted, my voice barely a breath. I feel like a target. Then be a target they can't hit, he said. As we descended the stairs, the room went silent. The music faltered for a heartbeat before resuming a low, sweeping waltz. We moved through the crowd, and I felt the weight of 1,000 stares. I saw Sarah and her friends from the academy, their faces twisted in a mixture of awe and bitter resentment. I saw the men who had once mocked me now bowing their heads, their eyes averted. It should have felt like a victory, but it felt like a funeral. Then, I saw her. Linda Smith was standing near the tall, arched windows, a glass of champagne in her hand. She was dressed in a dress of blood-red velvet, her silver hair pinned back with pins that looked like daggers. She didn't bow. She didn't move. She just watched me with those cold, calculating eyes. Bart was pulled away by a group of ministers to discuss a border dispute, leaving me at the edge of the dance floor. I tried to blend into the shadows near the refreshment table, but Linda was there before I could escape. She moved with a predatory grace, her perfume smelling of lilies and something sharp like ozone. You look quite the part, Celina, Linda said, her voice low, melodic hiss. The dress, the jewels, the king on your arm. It's a very convincing performance. It isn't a performance, Linda, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I thought of my training with Calvin and Bart. I squared my shoulders. I am the Luna. This is my home. Linda laughed, a dry, brittle sound. Home? This palace is built on the bones of people who thought they belonged here? You think those golden eyes make you special? You think you are the first woman to bring that light into this lineage? I froze. What do you know about my eyes? Linda stepped closer, her face inches from mine. I knew your mother, Emma. She was a beautiful thing, wasn't she? So quiet, so fragile. She thought she could hide in the shadows of the Smith estate. She thought she could carry a secret that belonged to the winter. The air in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. My mother worked for your family. She was a seamstress. She was a mistake, Linda spat, the mask of politeness finally slipping. She was the mistress of my husband, a man who didn't understand that some bloodlines are meant to stay pure. She carried a child that carried the mark of the winter wolf, a power that hasn't been seen in this kingdom for 1,000 years, a power that threatened everything I had built. My heart felt like it was being squeezed by an icy hand. The fever. She didn't die of a fever, did she? Linda smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. Fevers are so convenient, aren't they? They leave no marks. They tell no tales. I ended her, Celina. I wiped that stain from my family's history, and I thought I had wiped you out too when your father took you away. I should have been more thorough. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The room was spinning, the music sounding like a distant, distorted scream. My mother had been murdered. My entire life, the poverty, the abuse, the struggle, had been orchestrated by the woman standing in front of me to keep me small, to keep me from ever realizing what I was. "Why are you telling me this now?" I whispered. "Because the winter is here, Celina," Linda said, her eyes blazing with a mad, obsessive light. "And I will finish what I started. You and that bastard you carry, you will never see the spring." She turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd like a ghost. I stood there, shaking, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I looked around for Bart, but he was gone. The ballroom felt like a cage, the walls closing in, the candles flickering out, one by one in my mind. I stumbled toward the balcony, needing air, needing to run. I reached the stone railing and gripped it until my knuckles went white. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the doors. My eyes weren't just gold anymore. They were pulsing with a faint, rhythmic light, a glow that seemed to come from deep within my soul. Suddenly, a hand clamped over my mouth. I tried to scream, but the sound was muffled by a heavy, scented cloth. I fought, kicking and scratching, using the moves Calvin had taught me, but my attacker was stronger, faster. I felt a sharp prick in my neck, a needle. "Shh, little wolf," a voice whispered in my ear. It was Celina, the sperm thief. "The king can't save you now. You're going back to where you belong." The world went black. The last thing I felt was the cold wind of winter biting at my skin, and the last thing I saw was the golden light of my own eyes, fading into the dark. The darkness was not a void. It was a cage of ice. When I finally opened my eyes, the first thing I felt was the biting kiss of a mountain winter. I was no longer in the silk-lined rooms of the palace or the grand marble ballroom. I was lying on the frozen dirt floor of a derelict hunting cabin, high in the jagged peaks that bordered the Smith estate. My wrists were bound with heavy silver chains, metal designed to suppress the spirit of an alpha and apparently someone like me. Across the room, Celina sat on a wooden crate, tossing a silver dagger between her hands. She looked unraveled. Her expensive dress was torn at the hem, and her eyes were bloodshot, reflecting a desperate, frantic energy. In the corner, shadowed and still, stood Linda Smith. She looked like a statue of spite, her gaze fixed on my stomach with a loathing that made the air feel thin. "You're awake," Celina spat, the dagger catching a sliver of moonlight. "Finally. I wanted you to be conscious when I carved that brat out of you. I wanted you to see exactly what happens to an Omega who tries to steal a king's crown." "Celina, stop," I croaked, my throat feeling like it was filled with glass. "You don't have to do this. Linda is using you. She killed my mother, and she'll kill you too once you've done her dirty work." Celina laughed, a high, jagged sound. "Your mother was a servant, just like you. I am the one who was supposed to be queen. I had the plan, I had the ambition, and you just walked into a hospital and took it all." She stood up, the silver blade gleaming as she approached me. I struggled against the chains, the metal burning my skin, but I was weak from the sedative. I looked at Linda, who hadn't moved. "Is this what you want, Linda?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "To murder another woman in the dark? To hide your secrets in the snow? My mother was a winter wolf. That's why you feared her, and that's why you fear me." Linda stepped into the light, her face a mask of cold fury. "Fear you? You are a mongrel, Celina. A half-breed mistake. The winter wolves were wiped out for a reason. They were too powerful, too wild. They didn't understand their place in the hierarchy. I didn't just kill your mother, I erased her. And tonight, I erased the last of her line." She nodded to Celina. "Do it. Now." Celina lunged. The silver blade arched through the air, aimed directly at my heart. In that heartbeat, the world slowed to a crawl. I felt a pulse in my womb, not a kick, but a surge of ancient, freezing energy. It was a call from the blood, a roar from 1,000 years ago that had been sleeping in my marrow, waiting for the moment the winter was threatened. My eyes didn't just glow, they ignited. A blinding golden light filled the cabin, so intense that Celina shielded her eyes with a scream. The silver chains didn't just break, they shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. I stood up, but I didn't feel like myself. I felt like the mountain. I felt like the blizzard. The air around me began to swirl with frost, the temperature in the cabin dropping until the wood groaned and cracked. "What?" What are you? Celina stammered, backing away, the dagger falling from her trembling fingers. I didn't answer with words. I answered with the wolf. The transformation wasn't a painful tearing of skin. It was an unfolding. A massive, snow-white wolf with fur like spun diamonds and eyes of molten gold stood where the lowly Omega had been. The power was intoxicating, a fierce, protective hunger that knew only one thing: protect the pack. Protect the child. I lunged. My paws hit the floor with the weight of an avalanche. Celina didn't even have time to scream before the sheer force of the winter wind I projected threw her against the wall, knocking her unconscious. Then I turned my gaze to Linda. The matriarch of the Smith family was finally afraid. She fumbled for a pistol hidden in her skirts, her hands shaking so violently she could barely aim. You? You monster! You cursed beast! I didn't kill her. That would have been too easy. I stepped toward her, the frost from my breath coating her face in a layer of ice. I let out a howl that shook the very foundations of the cabin, a sound that carried the grief of my mother and the strength of every winter wolf who had been hunted into silence. The door of the cabin exploded inward. Bart stood there, his coat covered in snow, his own alpha aura flared to its absolute limit. He looked at the unconscious Celina, the cowering Linda, and then his eyes found me. He didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a weapon. He walked toward the massive white wolf, his hand outstretched, his eyes filled with a recognition that went deeper than the contract. "Celina," he whispered, his voice steady and warm. "I'm here. You're safe. I found you." The golden light in my eyes softened. The ice in the air began to settle, falling like gentle snow onto the floor. I shifted back, the transition leaving me breathless and shivering. Bart caught me before I hit the ground, wrapping his heavy wool coat around my shoulders and pulling me against the heat of his chest. "I saw it," I whispered, my head lolling against his shoulder. "I saw what she did to my mother. I saw what I am." "I know," Bart said, his grip tightening. He looked at Linda with a look that promised a fate far worse than death. "And the world is going to know too. You aren't just a queen, Celina. You are the legend this kingdom has been waiting for." The aftermath was a whirlwind of justice. Linda Smith was stripped of her titles and her lands, her crimes against the winter wolves laid bare for the entire kingdom to see. Celina was exiled, her name erased from the records she had tried so hard to join. My stepfamily was never heard from again, disappearing into the shadows of the lower city where they belonged. Spring came early that year. I stood on the balcony of the palace, my hand resting on the swell of my stomach. The baby was strong, a little prince who already showed signs of the golden light in his eyes. Bart walked up behind me, his arms sliding around my waist. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The contract had long since been burned, replaced by a bond that was written in blood and ice. We were no longer playing a part. We were a pack. "The people are waiting," Bart said, nodding toward the courtyard where thousands had gathered to see their Luna. "Let them wait a little longer," I said, leaning back into him. I looked out at the horizon, where the mountains were finally turning green. I was no longer the girl who scrubbed floors. I was no longer the servant in the shadows. I was the winter wolf, and my kingdom was finally, truly mine. I took a deep breath of the fresh, sweet air and smiled. The winter was over, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving. I was home.